Hello and welcome to another edition of Hipaa in the News. In this edition for March of 2022, we're going to dive in and we're going to get started taking a look at some new legislation, basically a commission that's being proposed as basically an investigation into ways to realistically and reasonably implement Hipaa, and in particular, Hipaa healthcare data privacy rules, and make sure that these are implemented in a way that's reasonable in the real world, that accounts for real situations, and addresses the actual security risks that occur while not being too restrictive within the real healthcare environment. In particular, for covered entities that have been working with Hipaa, they've been, in many cases, dealing with Hipaa since it first came out in 1996. Now, there have been changes to Hipaa since then that have made it more restrictive and more detailed. But generally speaking, one of the main purposes of this committee would be to do an investigation for about 6 months. One of the senators who's put this commission, this kind of act in order to turn this commission into a reality, he is actually a medical professional and has experience working in the medical field and seeing what it's like trying to comply with Hipaa in reality, and all of the really confusion that exists around Hipaa in the real world, and a lot of the red tape that occurs. Now, some of this is really important to prevent data breaches and Hipaa privacy and security rule violations. So we're not here to say that it's not a critical thing. It's just really interesting that if you read this article, you'll see that basically Cassidy and Baldwin have proposed this legislation, and essentially one of the main stated goals is to make it match, basically make Hipaa better match what's really going on in the real world within Hipaa today. We think this is pretty exciting as a development. Of course, whether or not it turns into something, whether or not it actually gets approved and turned into a committee, and then finally that creates updates to the Hipaa rules and regulations, we'll certainly keep you posted. But this is an interesting development, and you can kind of see this trend toward the government overall trying to simplify and provide clarity around Hipaa rules and regulations. And next is a really interesting topic around what the covered entities or doctors or medical professionals own as far as Hipaa data. Now, this is really interesting. So whenever patients are working with a healthcare professional, that professional may have an agreement with the covered entity or their employer, essentially, that the data is owned by the covered entity. Now, this is probably what most people would expect. But then if you think about it, you would think, okay, you know, in many cases, it might make sense for my medical professional to actually own that data. What if they go somewhere else and I want to work with them at that other location? Well, herein lies the problem. There's essentially a concept of essentially who owns the data and who is going to be responsible for the data security, and how is this data going to be interoperable or transferable. And basically there's a whole concept around this called information blocking, or the information blocking rule. And the idea behind the information blocking rule is that it should be possible for the data to transfer between organizations without blocking, hence the name. And functionally what this means is that the systems need to use similar protocols, and that the different covered entities need to be able to reasonably share that data between themselves in a secure fashion. Now, there really isn't a specific set of regulations or even great examples of how this is supposed to occur mechanically in the real world. And so the state of Florida is exploring this and kind of looking into, what is this going to look like? How is this mechanically going to work? And specifically, what are we going to do for certain edge case scenarios? So this will be really interesting to see how it develops. This can essentially create a precedent for what would occur on a national level. So it's important to understand what happens in these local jurisdictions or state level jurisdictions to kind of see where things are going to develop within the industry at large. So we'll certainly keep you posted. We wanted to call it out that it's definitely something that you'll want to consider, is this concept of interoperability and making sure that you're not kind of pigeonholing yourself with that process. As well, if you're looking at some of your different healthcare providers and how those patient relationships, especially regarding data, work, this is something to clearly define and document and get it into a written format that your legal counsel and that your HIPAA specialist that you directly engage with, whether that's Clarity or another team, make sure that they're actually digging into this with you. And finally, to close things out, where would we be with HIPAA without talking about security? And in particular, there was, I believe this is the first newsletter or posting from Lisa Pino, who is the new director of the Office for Civil Rights. She posted a news article basically talking about cybersecurity. And you can see in her post, one of the main things that she's hitting on is essentially best practices for security. In particular, preventing ransomware and just general cybersecurity stance of being able to have a high availability disaster recovery type of scenario, so that if something gets attacked, if there's an impact from possible cybersecurity threats, which if you think about what time it is and what's going on, there are a lot of reasons for actors to be lashing out at the United States, unfortunately. And so this can impact high profile healthcare providers and covered entities because they might become a target. They might become a target from a political retaliation, etc. And so you can imagine that might be part of the impetus behind her saying, hey, you guys need to pay attention to this. You need to make sure that your security stance is solid. And really, this applies to everyone who's dealing with HIPAA data. It's a great reminder to go in and make sure that you're working with a third-party company or you have internal team members or a combination thereof that are constantly aware and diligently pursuing the best kind of industry best practice for your security, for your high availability, disaster recovery, and generally following the best practices that the OCR provides. And you can see there's some great links here that the Office of Civil Rights does provide, and you can really get into the details and kind of dive in on some of these nuances. We've also covered a lot of these nuances in some of our previous video series, so feel free to take a look at our channel on HIPAA, where we provide a lot of in the weeds details on some of these different areas around risk analysis, ransomware protection, hosting configuration, and so on. Of course, we appreciate the opportunity to share the updates in the HIPAA news with you. If you have any questions, feel free to reach out to our team. We're always happy to provide you with complimentary discovery and resources to help you along your journey with HIPAA. And until next time, bye for now.